The first time Grace Miller saw Daniel Hart, he was standing outside a small grocery store in the rain, holding a broken umbrella and pretending not to notice that everyone was staring at him. His coat was too thin for the weather, his shoes were worn at the edges, and his dark hair was dripping over his forehead like he had walked through half the town with nowhere to go. Most people passed him without slowing down. Some looked at him with pity. Others looked away, as if poverty were something contagious. But Grace stopped, not because she knew who he was, but because she knew what it felt like to be invisible. She had just finished a 12-hour shift at the diner, her feet aching, her hands smelling faintly of coffee and dish soap, and her paycheck already spent before it reached her pocket. Rent was due in 3 days. Her car had been making a strange noise every time she turned the key. And the electricity bill sat folded in her purse like a quiet threat. Grace did not have much to give anyone. That was what made what she did next impossible to forget. She walked toward the stranger, took off her own scarf, and placed it gently in his hands. "You'll get sick standing here like that," she said, her voice soft but steady. Daniel looked down at the scarf, then back at her face, as if he had forgotten what kindness looked like when it arrived without a price. For a moment, he almost told her the truth, that the coat was borrowed, that the worn shoes had been chosen on purpose, that he was not homeless, not lost, not poor, that his real name opened boardroom doors, moved markets, and made people stand straighter when he entered a room. But he said none of it, because Daniel Hart had come to Brookhaven with one question burning inside him. Could anyone love him without knowing what he owned? For years, women had smiled at his last name before they smiled at his face. Friends had appeared when the money was flowing and disappeared when he stopped saying yes. Even his former fiancée had once whispered, after too much champagne, that loving him was easy because his life came wrapped in luxury. Something in him had hardened after that, and so he decided to do something foolish, cruel, and unforgettable. He would hide who he was. He would live for a while as a man with nothing. No expensive watch, no private driver, no penthouse, no reputation, no family name powerful enough to make people forgive every flaw. He wanted to know what remained when the money vanished. But he never expected the answer to come through a woman like Grace Miller. Grace was not the kind of woman who dreamed about mansions. She dreamed about sleeping one full night without worrying about bills. She dreamed about fixing the cracked window in her apartment before winter settled in for good. She dreamed about opening a small flower shop one day, not because flowers made people rich, but because they made grief feel less lonely and love feel less afraid. She had been disappointed by life but not made bitter by it, and that was the part Daniel did not know how to understand. At first he told himself he was only observing her, testing her, learning whether her kindness would change when she thought he had nothing to offer. But kindness, when it is real, has a dangerous way of reaching places no plan can protect. Grace did not treat him like a project. She did not treat him like a problem. She spoke to him like a man. And the more she did, the more Daniel began to forget that he was lying. He learned the way she smiled when she was exhausted but refused to be rude. He learned that she hummed old songs while wiping tables at closing time. He learned that she kept a small notebook in her apron pocket filled with flower names, rent calculations, and fragments of prayers she never said aloud. He learned that she had been hurt before by people who took her tenderness and called it weakness. And he learned too late that the worst lies are not the ones told to strangers. They are the ones told to someone who has begun to trust you. By the time Grace fell in love with him, Daniel had already lost control of the test. He had wanted proof that someone could choose him without money. But Grace gave him something far more terrifying. She chose him when she thought he had nothing. She defended him when others mocked him. She believed in him when he gave her no reason to. And when he finally revealed the truth, he expected tears, joy, maybe even relief. Instead, Grace looked at him as if he had broken something sacred. "You didn't test my heart," she told him, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with a pain he would remember for the rest of his life. "You insulted it." Those 4 words did what no business rival, no family betrayal, no public scandal had ever done. They broke Daniel Hart completely, because in trying to find out whether Grace loved him for who he was, he had shown her exactly who he had become, and the question was no longer whether she could love a poor man. The question was whether she could ever forgive a rich one who had made her love feel like an experiment. Grace Miller had learned to measure people by what they did when no one important was watching, not by their clothes, not by their cars, not by the way they spoke when the room belonged to them. She had seen wealthy men leave pennies for exhausted waitresses, and people with almost nothing share their last piece of bread. So when she saw the man standing outside Whitmore's grocery in the rain, she did not ask herself if he was worth helping. She only wondered how long he had been pretending he did not need it. His umbrella was broken, his coat was too thin, and everyone else kept walking past him as if loneliness were invisible. Brookhaven was the kind of small town where people noticed everything and still missed what mattered most. They noticed who bought cheap bread, who drove a new car, who wore the same coat for too many winters. But they rarely noticed the quiet humiliation of standing in public with nowhere warm to go. Grace stood beneath the grocery store awning, holding a paper bag of discounted food against her hip. Her feet ached from a 12-hour shift at Maggie's diner, and her paycheck was already promised to rent, electricity, and the car that barely started. She had almost nothing extra to give, and still, she stepped into the rain. "Excuse me," she said softly. The man looked up, and his eyes unsettled her before anything else did. They were dark, tired, and too controlled, as if he had spent years training himself not to show pain. The broken umbrella bent in the wind, spilling rain over his shoulder. Grace tried a small smile. "That umbrella is losing the battle." For the first time, something almost gentle touched his face. "It has been brave," he answered. His voice surprised her. It was calm, educated, and strangely out of place with the worn shoes and plain coat. Grace studied him for one brief second too long. There was something about him that did not fit, like a man trying to disappear after a lifetime of being obeyed. But she had no right to question his story. Kindness, she believed, did not need a full explanation before it could begin. She reached for the faded blue scarf around her neck and unwound it slowly. It was not expensive, but it was warm, and it had survived 3 winters with her. The man's gaze dropped to it, then rose back to her face. "I can't take that," he said. "You can," Grace replied. "I have a coat." "A thin one," he said, glancing at the diner uniform beneath it. "That makes 2 of us," she said, "but I'm closer to home." For a moment, he did not move. Daniel Hart had signed contracts worth more than every building on that street, but the small scarf in Grace's hand made him feel poorer than he had expected. There was no calculation in her gesture, no flirtation, no performance, no hidden request, just concern. And concern without ambition was something Daniel no longer knew how to trust. He should have refused again. He had come to Brookhaven with a plan, and plans required distance. He would live for a while as a man with nothing, watch how people treated him, and prove to himself whether anyone could care without knowing his name. No private driver, no expensive watch, no Hart family reputation opening doors before he touched them. Just a borrowed coat, worn shoes, and the silence of a man pretending poverty could reveal truth. But Grace was still holding the scarf out to him. Refusing it began to feel cruel, so he took it. Their fingers brushed for less than a second, and Daniel noticed that her hand was colder than his. The realization struck him with unexpected shame. She had given him warmth she still needed herself. He wrapped the scarf around his neck, and the simple fabric felt heavier than luxury ever had. "Thank you," he said. Grace nodded as if she had done nothing remarkable. "You can return it someday if you want," she said. "I work at Maggie's diner 2 blocks over." "Maggie's," he repeated. "It's not fancy," she added, "but the coffee is strong and the pie is honest." This time, Daniel smiled. "Honest pie?" "The best kind," she said. A car rushed past too close to the curb, sending cold rainwater across the sidewalk. Grace stepped back, but not fast enough. The splash hit the side of her shoe and the hem of her coat. She closed her eyes for one tired second, then opened them again with the patience of someone used to absorbing small humiliations without making a scene. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. His first instinct was absurd and immediate. Call his driver, find the car, make someone apologize. But Daniel Hart was not supposed to have that kind of power here. "You should get home," he said quietly. "So should you," Grace answered. The words hung between them, simple and strangely intimate. For a moment, the grocery store sign buzzed above them. The rain softened the streetlights, and Daniel almost told her the truth. He almost said that he was not poor, not lost, not the man she thought she was helping. Instead, he only said, "I'm Daniel." "Grace," she replied. He repeated her name in his mind long after she turned and walked away. "Grace." It sounded less like a name and more like something he had not allowed himself to receive in years. Only when she disappeared down the wet sidewalk did he pull a phone from the inside pocket of his plain coat. The screen glowed with a message from his assistant in New York. "Sir, the Brookhaven acquisition papers are ready. We only need your approval." Daniel stared at the words until the rain blurred them. Brookhaven was not a town he had chosen at random. It was the next piece in a quiet expansion plan, a place his company intended to buy, renovate, reshape, and profit from. The grocery store, the old flower shop, the diner where Grace worked, all of it sat inside the district under review. Before meeting her, it had been a clean decision. Numbers, property values, projections, signatures. After meeting her, the map felt different. It had a human face. He should have approved the papers that night, before emotion complicated judgment. Before a woman with cold hands and a faded scarf became more than a data point in his private experiment, but his thumb hovered over the screen without moving. He looked down the street where Grace had gone, then touched the scarf at his throat. For the first time since planning his test, Daniel wondered whether he had come to expose other people's selfishness or hide from his own. He locked the phone without replying. Across town, Grace climbed the stairs to her small apartment, unaware that the stranger she had helped could have bought the entire building before breakfast. She set her groceries on the counter, slipped off her wet shoes, and rubbed warmth back into her hands. Her neck felt bare without the scarf, and for a moment she wondered if she had been foolish. Winter was coming quickly. Kindness did not lower rent. Kindness did not repair cracked windows. Kindness did not pay overdue bills. Still, she did not regret it. She made tea in a chipped mug and stood by the window watching rain slide down the glass. Brookhaven looked lonely from above, each lit window hiding a different worry. Grace pressed her palm against the cold frame and whispered the kind of prayer she only prayed when she was too tired to make it beautiful. Lord, help me make it through this month. She did not ask for a miracle. She had stopped asking for those years ago. The next morning, the bell above Maggie's diner rang just after 7. Grace looked up from behind the counter and found Daniel standing near the door, wearing the same plain coat and her blue scarf folded carefully around his neck. Surprise lit her face before she could hide it. "You came to return it?" she asked. Daniel touched the scarf lightly. "I came for honest pie." Grace laughed, and the sound warmed something in him he had not known was cold. She told him to sit anywhere, then turned to pour coffee before the morning rush swallowed her. Daniel chose the booth by the window and watched her move through the diner with tired grace, giving dignity in small, unnoticed ways. He told himself he was still observing her, still testing whether kindness changed when power was absent. But when Grace looked back and smiled as if she was glad he had returned, the lie inside him shifted. For the first time, Daniel feared the test was no longer about whether she could love a poor man. It was about whether he could become honest before she learned he never was one. Maggie's diner looked different in daylight than it did from the rainy sidewalk. At night, its windows glowed like a small promise against the dark, but in the morning, every crack in the red vinyl seats, every scratch on the counter, and every tired corner showed clearly. Still, there was warmth in the place. The smell of coffee lived in the walls. The old jukebox near the back booth blinked even when no one fed it coins. And Grace moved through it all as if she belonged to every table, every order, every quiet worry brought in by the people of Brookhaven. Daniel sat by the window, trying to look like a man who had nowhere better to be. That was harder than he had expected. He was used to rooms adjusting around him, assistants clearing his schedule, strangers recognizing his name before he introduced himself. Here, no one adjusted anything. A truck driver asked him to pass the sugar. An elderly woman leaned over and told him the blueberry pie was better on Thursdays. And Grace placed a chipped white mug in front of him as if he were simply another customer who needed coffee before the day began. "Careful," she said. "It's strong enough to make you confess your sins." Daniel looked up at her. "Should I be worried?" "That depends," she said, reaching for the pot. "Do you have many?" "More than you think," he almost answered. Instead, he gave her a faint smile and wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was hot, bitter, and far more honest than most conversations he had endured in expensive restaurants. Grace placed a slice of apple pie in front of him, even though breakfast had barely begun. "The famous honest pie," he said. "It has flaws," she replied. "That's how you know it's real." Daniel looked at the uneven crust, the apples bubbling through one broken edge, the cinnamon dark against the filling. He had eaten desserts designed like architecture and praised by people who photographed food before tasting it, but this pie, served by a tired woman with gentle eyes, made something in him ache before he even lifted the fork. "Did you make it?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "Maggie did, or she used to before the surgery. Now I try to follow her recipe and pretend she won't notice when I get it wrong." "She owns the diner?" "In every way that matters." And Daniel heard the careful sadness beneath the words. There were questions he could have asked. Financial questions, operational questions, questions that would tell him whether Maggie's diner was as vulnerable as the acquisition report suggested. But Grace was watching him, and for once Daniel did not want to sound like a man measuring a business. So he asked, "Is she recovering?" Grace's expression softened. "Slowly. She says hospitals are boring and nurses don't know how to make decent coffee." "That sounds like a good sign." "It is," Grace said. "But good signs don't always pay medical bills." The sentence escaped before she could stop it, and she looked away, embarrassed by her own honesty. Daniel felt the familiar instinct rise inside him again. Fix it, write the check, make the problem disappear before anyone has to feel the weight of it. Money had always been his most efficient language. It solved, silenced, bought, protected, erased. But he could not use that language here without exposing everything. And worse, he was beginning to understand that Grace might not thank him if he did. Before he could answer, a sharp voice came from near the kitchen. "Grace, table 4 has been waiting." Brian, Maggie's nephew, stood with a clipboard in his hand and irritation on his face, as if managing a small diner had made him ruler of a fragile kingdom. Grace straightened immediately. "I'm on it." Brian's eyes moved to Daniel's worn shoes, then to the scarf around his neck. "You know him?" "He's a customer," Grace said. Brian gave a short, humorless laugh. "He looks like he came in to get warm, not to pay." The diner quieted in that uncomfortable way rooms do when people pretend not to listen. Daniel's hand tightened around the fork. He had heard insults before, but usually they were polished, delivered by rivals in tailored suits. This one was cheap, small, and aimed at a man Brian believed could not answer back. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not blush or apologize for Daniel's presence. She simply turned to Brian and said, "Then I'm glad he found somewhere warm." A few customers looked down at their plates. Brian's jaw hardened. Power, Daniel thought, looked ugliest when held by people terrified of losing it. He could destroy Brian's authority with one phone call. He could have the diner's debt reviewed, the property secured, the man removed before lunch. But he did nothing, not because Brian deserved restraint, because Grace did. If Daniel used his real power, everything between them would shift before it had even begun. She would see the money first, the man second, so he stayed silent while Grace carried plates to table 4, her shoulders calm, her dignity intact. And for the first time in years, Daniel understood that restraint could be harder than control. When she returned to his booth, her smile was still there, but dimmer. "Sorry about that," she said. "For what?" "For Brian." Daniel leaned back slightly. "Do you apologize for other people often?" "Only when they make the room colder," she said, placing a napkin beside his plate. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw how much kindness cost her. "You didn't have to defend me," he said. "I wasn't defending you because you needed it." Grace met his eyes. "I was defending the kind of place I want to work in." The words landed harder than she could have known. Daniel had spent years building companies, acquiring properties, restructuring entire districts under words like growth and efficiency. But Grace had just described belonging in a way no report ever had. A place was not only what it earned, it was what people felt allowed to be inside it. He took a bite of the pie because he needed something to do with the silence. Grace waited, eyebrows raised. "Well?" Daniel swallowed slowly. "It's honest." Her smile returned, brighter this time, and the small victory of making her smile unsettled him more than Brian's insult had. He was not supposed to want that. He was supposed to be observing, not hoping she would linger. But Grace did linger. Only for a few seconds because the diner was busy and Brian was watching from the kitchen door. Still, she leaned lightly against the edge of the booth and said, "So Daniel, what brings you to Brookhaven?" The question was ordinary. The answer was not. He looked out the window where the wet street shone beneath a pale morning sky. "I needed to disappear for a while," he said. Grace did not laugh. She did not ask from whom. Instead, her face softened with a kind of understanding that made lying feel more shameful than usual. "I think everyone wants that at least once," she said. "To disappear? To be seen without being expected to perform." Daniel turned back to her. For one dangerous moment, he felt as if she had reached across the table and touched the exact place his money had never protected. Brian called her name again and the moment broke. Grace stepped away, but Daniel's gaze followed her through the diner. She refilled coffee, balanced plates, smiled at customers who barely looked up, and moved as if exhaustion were something she had trained herself to carry quietly. He had come to Brookhaven to test whether people were kind when they believed there was nothing to gain. But with every minute he spent near Grace, the test felt less like wisdom and more like cowardice. He was not discovering her character, he was hiding his own. When Daniel finally left the diner, his phone vibrated before he reached the corner. A message from his assistant lit the screen. "Mr. Hart, the sellers are nervous. If we delay again, we may lose the Brookhaven district deal." Daniel looked back through the diner window. Grace was laughing softly with an elderly customer, one hand pressed to her heart. He thought of the scarf, the pie, the way she had defended a man she believed had nothing. Then he typed a reply that would confuse his entire company. "Delay it again. I need more time." Daniel returned to Maggie's diner the next morning, and the morning after that, until his presence stopped feeling like an event and began to feel like part of the place. He always chose the same booth by the window, always ordered coffee first, and always waited for Grace to recommend whatever pie had survived the breakfast rush. To everyone else, he was simply the quiet stranger with the worn shoes and the faded blue scarf. To Grace, he became a question she did not want to answer too quickly. There was sadness in him, but not the kind that asked for pity. It was the kind that sat upright, spoke politely, and kept its deepest wound behind locked doors. At first, she told herself she was only being kind. Kindness was easy to justify. She brought him coffee before he asked because she noticed when his hands were cold. She saved him the last slice of apple pie because he pretended not to care, but always looked pleased when she did. She spoke to him during quiet minutes because silence around him felt less empty than silence around most people. But Grace knew the difference between kindness and waiting, and by the end of the week, she realized she had begun waiting for the bell above the door. Daniel noticed it too, and that made the lie heavier. Every time Grace smiled when he entered, something inside him stepped closer to confession. Every time Brian looked at him with contempt, Daniel had to remind himself not to become the man who could end that contempt with a signature. His test had seemed logical from a distance. Now it felt cruel in the smallest details. Grace did not see a billionaire hiding among ordinary people. She saw a man she believed life had bruised, and she was careful with him because of it. One afternoon, the diner emptied earlier than usual after a storm warning sent most customers home. Rain tapped against the windows soft and steady while Grace wiped the counter and Daniel sat with both hands around a mug of coffee gone cold. Brian had gone to argue with the supplier in the back, leaving the front room strangely peaceful. Grace glanced at Daniel's untouched pie. "You know," she said, "most people eat dessert instead of studying it." Daniel looked down and smiled faintly. "I was thinking, that sounds dangerous." "It usually is," he said. Grace leaned against the counter, towel in hand. About what? He should have said something harmless. The weather, the pie, the old jukebox that only played 3 songs correctly. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Do you think people can love someone without wanting something from them?" The question came out too honest, and the room seemed to grow quieter around it. Grace did not answer quickly. She folded the towel once, then again, as if giving the question the respect it demanded. "I think people can," she said at last, "but I also think most people are afraid to believe it." Daniel looked at her. "Are you afraid?" He nodded. Grace's smile faded, but not completely. "Yes, sometimes." The answer reached him in a place no compliment ever had. Grace was not pretending to be fearless. She was not offering the simple sweetness of someone who had never been hurt. She knew what disappointment cost. She knew trust was not a ribbon tied around a pretty feeling. It was a door opened slowly after someone else had once slammed it hard enough to crack the frame, and still she had opened a small door for him. "My mother used to say, 'Love is easy when nothing is at stake,'" Grace said. "She said you only know what someone carries when staying costs them something." Daniel's throat tightened. "What happened to her?" Grace looked toward the rain-dark window. "She died when I was 22. The words were quiet, but the room changed around them. Daniel straightened, suddenly ashamed of every false thing he had ever allowed her to believe. "I'm sorry," he said. Grace nodded, accepting the words without making them heavier. "She wanted to open a flower shop." "Is that why you keep the notebook?" Grace's eyes lifted in surprise. "You noticed that?" Daniel almost said he noticed everything about her. The way she tucked loose hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The way she counted change twice when bills worried her. The way she touched the little cross at her neck before difficult conversations. "I saw you writing in it," he said instead. Grace hesitated, then pulled the small notebook from her apron pocket. The cover was bent, softened by use, and held together with a strip of clear tape. Inside were sketches of flower arrangements, names of suppliers, rent calculations, and phrases written in the margins like prayers that did not know where else to go. Daniel saw columns of numbers so small they looked almost painful, a dream measured against what survival allowed. For a man who bought buildings without blinking, it was unbearable. "I know it sounds foolish," Grace said, closing the notebook before he could read too much. "A flower shop is not foolish. It is when your car sounds like it's dying and your landlord has stopped pretending to be patient." There it was again, the opening for money to solve everything. Daniel could have paid her rent for a year with less than he spent on a single business dinner. He could have repaired her car, bought the empty shop on Maple Street, placed the keys in her hands. But then what would she see when she looked at him? A generous man, or a liar trying to decorate his deception with gifts? Daniel looked away because he did not trust his face. The test was beginning to hurt not because Grace was failing it, but because she was passing it with a grace that made him feel small. He had wanted to know whether someone could love him without money, but he had not considered whether he could love someone without using money as a shield. The thought frightened him more than any loss ever had. "Maybe the dream is not gone," he said carefully. Grace gave a soft laugh, but there was no bitterness in it. "Dreams are strange. They don't always leave. Sometimes they just get quiet so you can survive." Daniel looked at her then, and the urge to tell her the truth became almost physical. His name, his company, the acquisition, the fact that the empty flower shop she loved might soon belong to him if he signed one document. Before he could speak, Brian pushed through the kitchen door with a stack of invoices. His mood had clearly worsened. "Grace, why are you standing around?" She slipped the notebook back into her apron, face closing like a window. "The front is empty." "Then clean something twice," he snapped. His eyes moved to Daniel. "And you? One coffee doesn't buy you a living room?" The words landed with cheap cruelty. Grace turned sharply. "Brian." "What?" he said. "It's a business, not a shelter." Daniel set the mug down very slowly. Something cold and familiar moved through him, the part of Daniel Hart that had ended negotiations with a sentence and ruined arrogant men without raising his voice. But Grace stepped slightly between them, not because Daniel needed protection, but because she did not want the room to become uglier. That wounded him more than the insult. "I'll cover his coffee," Grace said. Daniel looked up. "No." She glanced at him, confused by the sudden firmness in his voice. He softened it quickly. "I mean, you don't need to do that." Brian laughed under his breath. "Pride is expensive when your pockets are empty." Grace's face flushed, not for herself but for Daniel, and Daniel hated himself for letting her feel embarrassed on behalf of a man who owned more than Brian could imagine. After Brian disappeared again, the diner felt colder. Grace came back to the booth and placed the bill face down on the table. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Daniel looked at her hand resting near the edge of the table, close enough that he could have reached for it. "Stop apologizing for people who should know better." She held his gaze. "Then stop acting like you deserve the way they treat you." The words struck him so directly that for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Grace walked away before he could answer, but her words stayed. Daniel paid for the coffee and pie with carefully worn bills from the small amount of cash he carried for the role he was playing. Outside, the storm had deepened, turning the street into a blur of gray. His phone vibrated again, another message asking for approval, another reminder that his real life was waiting behind the lie. He looked back through the window and saw Grace cleaning a table, her notebook tucked safely in her apron, her dream folded small enough to carry. For the first time, Daniel understood that if he continued the test, it would not reveal Grace's heart. It would destroy her trust. The first time Daniel saw Grace outside the diner, she was standing in front of the empty flower shop on Maple Street. It was early evening and the sky had turned the soft gray blue that comes just before night settles over a small town. The shop window was dusty, the old sign above the door was faded, and a strip of paper taped to the glass read, "For lease," in red letters. Grace stood with her hands tucked into the pockets of her thin coat, looking at the place as if it were both a promise and a wound. Daniel stopped across the street before she noticed him. For a moment, he saw not the waitress who smiled through exhaustion, but the woman who still had a dream she was afraid to touch. He should have kept walking. That was what a careful man would have done. But Daniel was discovering with growing discomfort that he was less careful around Grace than he had spent his life being around everyone else. He crossed the street slowly, giving her enough time to hear his footsteps. Grace turned, and surprise softened her face. "Daniel," she said. His name sounded different in her voice now, warmer, more familiar, more dangerous. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You're not interrupting," she answered, though she looked almost embarrassed to be found there. Daniel glanced at the dark shop window. "This is the place?" Grace followed his gaze and nodded. "My mother used to stop here when I was little. Back then it was called Rose and Rail. The owner knew every birthday, every funeral, every apology in town." She smiled faintly. "I used to think flowers were how people said what they were too afraid to say out loud." Daniel looked at the dusty glass, imagining Grace inside with light around her, arranging color in a world that had given her too much gray. "It suits you," he said. Grace turned to him with a guarded little laugh. "An abandoned shop with a broken sign?" "No," he said. "A place that helps people say what matters." The laughter faded from her face, replaced by something quieter. For a second, Daniel feared he had said too much. Then Grace looked down and he saw that his words had reached her. They walked together after that, not because either of them suggested it clearly, but because neither seemed willing to leave first. Brookhaven's Main Street was beginning to glow with evening lights. The bakery was closing, the pharmacy sign blinked unevenly, and rain from the previous days still gathered in shallow cracks along the sidewalk. Grace told him small things about the town, which store owner gave extra bread to people who could not pay, which church bell was always 3 minutes late, which bench caught the warmest sun in winter. Daniel listened with the attention of a man studying land he had once seen only as property. Through Grace's eyes, every building became a memory instead of an asset. When they reached the old bridge near the river, Grace stopped. The water below moved dark and slow, carrying reflections of streetlights in trembling gold. "This is my favorite place when I need to think," she said. Daniel leaned beside her on the railing, careful not to stand too close. "What do you think about?" "Everything I can't afford," she said, then winced at her own honesty. "I'm sorry, that sounded heavier than I meant it to." "Maybe some things are heavy because they're true." Grace looked at him then, studying his face in the fading light. "You say things like someone who understands more than he explains." Daniel's hand tightened around the railing. That was the problem with Grace. She did not pry, but she saw. She saw the pauses, the careful answers, the pain behind words chosen too neatly. He had built his disguise around what people usually noticed first: clothes, money, status. He had not prepared for a woman who noticed absence, for a woman who could hear the locked door inside a sentence. "My life became something I didn't recognize," he said slowly. "It was not the full truth, but it was not entirely a lie. I needed to know who I was without all of it." Grace did not ask what all of it meant. Instead, she folded her arms against the cold and looked out at the water. "I think we all want that. To know there's something left when life strips us down." Daniel turned toward her. "And what did life strip from you?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, but the pain beneath it was old. "My mother first, then the house we lived in, then the version of myself that believed working hard always saved you." Daniel swallowed. "I'm sorry." "I know," she smiled sadly. "But I'm still here. Some days that has to count as victory." It did, Daniel thought. More than anything he had ever called success. The wind moved softly over the river, lifting a strand of hair across Grace's cheek. Without thinking, Daniel reached to move it away, then stopped himself halfway. Grace noticed. Neither of them laughed. Neither looked away. The space between them changed, becoming charged with all the things still unsaid. Daniel could have kissed her then. He wanted to with a force that startled him. But the lie stood between them, invisible and enormous. Grace broke the silence first. "You know what scares me about you?" Daniel's heart tightened. "What?" "You feel temporary." The words hit him harder than an accusation would have. Grace looked back at the river, as if it was easier to confess to the water than to his face. "Like one day I'll come into the diner and you'll just be gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just an empty booth and a coffee mug I keep looking at like a fool." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He had intended to leave. That had been part of the plan. Come to Brookhaven, observe, decide, disappear. No emotional damage, no promises. No consequences beyond the private satisfaction of knowing whether his bitterness had been justified. But now Grace was naming the wound before he made it, and he felt, with a force close to fear, that he did not want to become another person she had to survive. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. Grace looked at him again, and this time there was no softness hiding the seriousness in her eyes. "Then don't let me care about someone who doesn't plan to stay." The sentence was not dramatic. She did not cry. She did not beg. That made it worse. It was the voice of a woman who had fought too hard for her own dignity to hand it over blindly. Daniel wanted to tell her everything, that his name was not just Daniel, but Daniel Hart, the man behind the company quietly circling Brookhaven, that he had not stumbled into her life by accident, that the empty flower shop, the diner, and half the street she loved were all sitting inside a deal waiting for his signature. That he had begun this as a test and now hated himself for continuing it, but fear sealed his mouth, not fear of losing his money or reputation, fear of watching her eyes change. "I can't promise I know how to stay," he said. Grace absorbed that, and the disappointment in her face was small but unmistakable. "Then promise you won't pretend." The words were almost too merciful. She was giving him a doorway to honesty, a chance to step through before the lie became unforgivable. Daniel stood on the edge of it, feeling the whole weight of who he was behind him. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked down before he could stop himself. A message flashed across the screen from his assistant. "The board is pressing. They want the Brookhaven acquisition finalized tomorrow." Grace saw only the change in his expression, not the words. "Bad news?" she asked. Daniel locked the phone quickly. "Something I have to handle." There it was again, the vague answer, the careful wall, the small betrayal dressed as privacy. Grace nodded, but the warmth between them had cooled. "I should go," she said. Daniel stepped forward. "Grace?" She paused. He had one more chance, one clean chance to stop the damage from deepening. But all he could manage was, "Will I see you tomorrow?" Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That depends on whether you come as yourself." She walked away across the bridge, leaving Daniel alone with the river, the cold, and the words he had been too cowardly to answer. The phone in his hand vibrated again, demanding the decision that would change Brookhaven before anyone in town knew it was coming. Daniel stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Grace had made her choice without even knowing the whole truth. She would not beg. She would not chase a man who lived behind locked doors. And if he wanted her heart, he would have to stop hiding before the truth arrived without mercy. The next morning, Grace woke before her alarm, already carrying the weight of words she wished she had not said. "That depends on whether you come as yourself." The sentence followed her through the small apartment while she made coffee, tied her hair back, and checked the cracked window that had let in cold air all night. She did not regret saying it. That was the hardest part. Grace had spent too many years accepting half-truths from people who wanted her warmth but not her questions. Whatever Daniel was hiding, she knew one thing clearly. She could not fall in love with a shadow. At Maggie's diner, the morning moved with its usual noise. Plates clattered, coffee poured, chairs scraped against the floor, and Brian complained that people ordered breakfast as if food costs had not gone up. Grace worked with practiced calm, but her eyes kept drifting toward the door every time the bell rang. A mailman, 2 nurses from the clinic. Mr. Collins with his newspaper folded under one arm. Not Daniel. By 9 o'clock, the booth by the window sat empty, and Grace hated the part of herself that noticed. She told herself it was better this way. A man who could not answer a simple question honestly would only bring pain later. Maybe he had left town. Maybe he had decided she was too much trouble. Maybe her instinct had been right, and he had always been temporary. Still, when she picked up the coffee pot and looked at the empty booth, she felt a small, foolish ache. It was embarrassing how quickly a stranger could become a habit. More embarrassing still how deeply she had wanted him to stay. Near noon, a black car stopped outside the diner. It did not belong on Maple Street. It was too polished, too silent, too certain of its place in the world. Conversation slowed as people turned toward the window. Brian stepped out from behind the counter, suddenly alert in the way people become when money enters a room before a person does. Grace stood still, coffee pot in hand. The driver's door opened first, then the back door. Daniel stepped out in a dark tailored suit. No worn shoes, no plain coat, no broken umbrella, no faded blue scarf around his neck. His hair was neatly combed back, his posture sharper, his face unreadable beneath the weight of who he truly was. For one suspended second, Grace's mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. The man outside the diner looked like Daniel, but he also looked like someone who had never needed to ask where he would sleep, what he could afford, or whether the world would make room for him. The diner door opened and the bell rang with a brightness that felt almost cruel. Daniel entered first, followed by a woman in a navy business dress carrying a leather folder and a man Grace recognized from the bank. Silence spread across the room. Brian's expression changed instantly, smoothing into a nervous smile. "Good morning," he said, wiping his hands on his apron as if that could make him look professional. Daniel did not look at him. His eyes found Grace immediately, and in that moment, she understood. Not everything, not the details, but enough. The worn shoes had been chosen. The plain coat had been costume. The helplessness had been performance. The man she had defended, fed, worried about and prayed for had not been poor. He had been hiding. No, worse than hiding. He had allowed her to care for a version of him that did not exist. "Grace," Daniel said. Her name in his voice almost broke her composure because it sounded the same. That was what hurt most. The man in the suit sounded like the man in the rain. Her heart recognized him before her dignity could reject him. She placed the coffee pot on the counter carefully, afraid that if she moved too quickly, something inside her would shatter in public. Brian looked from Daniel to Grace, confusion sharpening into suspicion. "You two know each other?" Daniel finally looked at Brian. His voice was calm, but the room seemed to bend around it. "Yes." The single word carried more authority than anything Brian had ever said loudly. The woman with the folder stepped forward. "Mr. Hart, we can review the diner documents here if you prefer." Mr. Hart. Grace felt the name hit the room before it hit her heart. Hart, as in Hartwell Development, the company everyone had been whispering about for weeks without knowing who stood behind it. Miss Ruth gasped softly from her corner table. The bank manager adjusted his tie. Brian went pale, then red, then pale again. Grace did not move. Her mind returned with brutal clarity to every moment she had offered him compassion. The scarf, the pie, the bridge, the question, "Come as yourself." And now he had, but not because he chose courage, because the truth had finally arrived wearing a suit. Daniel took one step toward her. "I wanted to tell you." Grace almost laughed, but the sound died before it reached her mouth. Wanted. Such a soft word for something he had refused to do. When? She asked quietly. The diner was silent enough for everyone to hear. When I gave you my scarf? When Brian insulted you? When I showed you the flower shop? Or when I asked you not to pretend? Daniel's face tightened with pain. The businesswoman shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Hart, perhaps this is not the appropriate— It is, Daniel said without looking away from Grace. Then he turned to the room, to Brian, to the bank manager, to the people of Brookhaven whose lives had been reduced to columns in reports. My company has been negotiating to acquire several properties in this district, including this building. The words landed like a plate dropped on tile. Gasps, murmurs, chairs moving. Grace gripped the edge of the counter. Brian found his voice first. Acquire? Wait, this diner is not for sale. The bank manager cleared his throat. The property debt has created certain options. Grace turned toward him sharply. What options? No one answered fast enough. That silence told her more than an explanation would have. Maggie's bills, the surgery, the delayed payments, Brian's anxiety, the pressure she had felt but never fully understood, all of it had been leading to this. And Daniel had known. You knew Maggie's was in trouble, Grace said. Daniel did not deny it. I saw the reports. The reports, she repeated, as if the word tasted bitter. To you, this place was a report? At first, he said, and the honesty came too late to be mercy. At first, his eyes softened. Then I met you? Grace shook her head, the hurt in her face cutting deeper than anger could have. No, she said, do not make me the reason you suddenly remembered we were people. Daniel flinched. Around them, no one seemed to breathe. Grace's voice trembled now, but it did not break. You came here dressed as a man with nothing, and you watched how we treated you. You let me feel sorry for you. You let me defend you. You let me think I was helping someone who needed kindness. Her eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. And all this time, you were deciding what to do with our lives. I delayed the deal, Daniel said. The words came out quickly, desperately, as if they could repair the wound. I delayed it because of you, because I started seeing what this town meant, what the diner meant, what your dream meant. Grace stared at him. There it was, the confession he thought might save him. He had delayed the damage, not confessed the truth. He had protected his image of himself longer than he had protected her trust. You delayed it, she said softly, but you did not stop lying. Daniel's mouth closed. For the first time since entering the diner, he looked less like a man who owned the room and more like the stranger in the rain. Grace walked to the small hook near the register where her blue scarf hung after she had found it folded outside the diner door the previous evening. She took it down, crossed the room, and held it out to him. Daniel looked at it as if she had placed his own guilt in his hands. I gave this to a man I thought was cold, she said. But you were never cold, Daniel. You were protected. He did not take the scarf. Grace's voice lowered, and every word seemed to leave a mark. You didn't test my heart? Daniel's eyes shone, but he said nothing. You insulted it. The room blurred around him, but Grace remained painfully clear. She set the scarf on the nearest table and stepped back. Then, before he could find words expensive enough or humble enough to stop her, Grace untied her apron, placed it on the counter, and walked out of Maggie's diner with her head high and her heart breaking where everyone could see. Grace did not remember walking home. She remembered the cold air touching her face, the sound of the diner door closing behind her, and the strange silence that followed once she stepped away from the room where everyone had watched her heart break. Brookhaven streets looked the same, but something in them had changed. The grocery store, the old flower shop, the cracked sidewalks, the diner windows glowing behind her, all of it felt fragile now. As if the town had been made of paper, and Daniel Hart had been holding the match long before she ever knew his name. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from humiliation, from anger, from the awful memory of every gentle word she had given him while he stood safely behind a lie. She closed the door, leaned her back against it, and pressed one hand to her mouth. Only then did the tears come. They came fast, hot, and silent, the kind of tears that made no performance for anyone because there was no one left to witness them. Grace slid down to the floor and let herself break for exactly 1 minute. Then she wiped her face and stood up. Pain had visited her life before. It knew the address, but Grace had learned a long time ago that if she let pain move in and unpack everything, it would rearrange her whole heart. So she made tea with trembling hands, even though she did not want tea. She changed out of her diner uniform, even though her body felt heavy. She folded the uniform and placed it on the chair. Then she took out her notebook and opened it to the page where she had written numbers for the flower shop. The dream looked smaller than ever on paper. Deposit, first month's rent, second-hand cooler, basic supplies, flowers wholesale, license fee, emergency fund, if miracles were real, and numbers learned mercy. Grace looked at the careful columns and felt foolish for ever believing that dreams could survive in a town being bought by men who called people assets before learning their names. She closed the notebook, then opened it again. No, she thought. Daniel did not get to steal the dream too. At Maggie's diner, Daniel remained standing long after Grace left. The scarf lay on the table between him and the life he had ruined. No one spoke at first. Even Brian, who usually filled silence with opinions, looked as if he had discovered the cost of cruelty too late. Daniel stared at the door Grace had walked through, still hearing her words. "You didn't test my heart. You insulted it." He had once believed heartbreak was dramatic, loud, something that tore through a room. Now he knew it could be quieter than a woman setting down an apron. His assistant, Claire, stepped beside him, her leather folder held tightly against her chest. "Mr. Hart," she said carefully. "We should leave." Daniel looked at the scarf. "No. Sir, this has become complicated." He almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because business language suddenly felt obscene. Complicated was a delayed contract. Complicated was a board disagreement. This was not complicated. This was damage. Damage he had done with his own hands while calling it caution. He turned to the bank manager. "What exactly is the status of this property?" The man blinked, startled by the cold precision in Daniel's voice. "There are outstanding debts, medical-related delays, maintenance liens, and a potential foreclosure pathway if obligations are not met." Brian gripped the counter. "Foreclosure? You told me we had time." The bank manager avoided his eyes. Daniel felt disgust rise in his throat. At the bank, at Brian, at the system, and most of all, at himself. He had read those words in a report and felt nothing until Grace gave them a face. "Stop all movement on this property," Daniel said. Claire looked at him sharply. "Daniel, now!" The bank manager hesitated. "With respect, Mr. Hart, there are processes already." "Then reverse them." His voice did not rise, but every person in the diner understood that the man who had pretended to be powerless was gone. The authority Grace had never asked to see filled the room, and Daniel hated how easily it came back to him. Power had always obeyed him faster than love ever would. He picked up the scarf carefully, folding it once, then again. The fabric still seemed to hold the memory of rain, coffee, and a woman who had believed he was cold. Brian watched him with a strange mixture of fear and resentment. "So what happens now?" Brian asked. Daniel looked at him. "Now you stop speaking to people like poverty makes them less human?" Brian's face flushed. Daniel could have said more. He wanted to, but humiliating Brian would not unhumiliate Grace. Instead, Daniel turned to Claire. "I want Maggie's medical bills reviewed, quietly. I want every debt connected to this diner identified. No public announcements, no press, no Hartwell branding." Claire's expression tightened. "Are you trying to save the property or buy forgiveness?" The question hit harder because Claire had worked for him long enough to speak truths others avoided. Daniel looked toward the door. "I don't know yet." "Then be careful," she said. "Money moves quickly. Trust does not." Grace did not return to the diner that day or the next. On the third morning, Miss Ruth came by her apartment with a paper bag of muffins and a look that said she knew better than to ask too many questions. "I thought you might need breakfast," the older woman said. Grace stepped aside to let her in. They sat at the small kitchen table where the paint had chipped near one corner and the heater clicked uselessly against the cold. Miss Ruth looked at the notebook lying open beside Grace's mug. "Still thinking about the flower shop?" Grace traced the edge of the page. "Thinking is free? So is giving up," Miss Ruth said. Grace looked up, surprised. The older woman shrugged. "Doesn't mean it costs nothing." Grace breathed out slowly. "I don't know what to do. Maggie's may not survive. Maple Street may not survive. And Her voice caught, but she forced it steady. "I feel stupid. I thought I was helping a man who needed kindness. Instead, I was being studied." Miss Ruth reached across the table and covered Grace's hand with her own. "Kindness is never stupid just because someone else misuses it." Grace looked down and tears blurred the notebook lines. "That doesn't make it hurt less." "No," Miss Ruth said. "It makes sure the hurt does not become your teacher." Grace closed her eyes. She wanted anger to protect her. She wanted bitterness to make the memory of Daniel easier to carry. But some part of her still saw the man on the bridge, struggling to say what fear kept locked inside him. Across town, Daniel stood alone inside the empty flower shop. He had obtained the key through channels so efficient they made him feel ashamed. The air smelled of dust, old wood, and rain that had found its way through a leak near the back wall. Light entered through the dirty front window, falling across the floor in pale rectangles. Daniel imagined Grace there again, not as a fantasy to comfort him, but as an accusation. She had loved this place when it had nothing to offer but possibility. He had nearly bought it as part of a package. Claire stood near the door, tablet in hand. The board is not going to understand this delay much longer. Then they can misunderstand it. This is not how you usually operate. Daniel looked at the cracked wall where an old shelf had once hung. No, he said, it is not. Claire softened just a little. Are you going to tell her what you're doing? Daniel shook his head. If I do, it becomes another purchase. For the first time, he understood the trap clearly. If he saved the diner, she might think he was buying absolution. If he leased the flower shop for her, she would see a golden cage built from guilt. If he did nothing, the town might suffer under the very machine he had set in motion. Money could repair roofs, erase debt, delay foreclosure, and reopen doors. But it could not return the moment before Grace knew the truth. It could not make the man in the rain real. That evening, Daniel went to Grace's apartment building and stopped outside before climbing the stairs. He stood there for nearly 20 minutes, one hand inside his coat pocket, where the folded scarf rested like a verdict. He had faced hostile boards, public accusations, and negotiations designed to break him. None of them had frightened him like the thought of knocking on Grace Miller's door with nothing to offer except the truth she had asked for before he deserved the chance to give it. Finally, he climbed the stairs. Each step sounded louder than the last. When Grace opened the door, she did not look surprised. Perhaps she had heard him pause outside. Perhaps some wounds recognized the footsteps of the person who caused them. Daniel stood in the hallway without a driver, without an assistant, without a contract, without any disguise left. He held out the folded blue scarf with both hands. I am not here to ask you to forgive me, he said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. I am here to tell you the truth without making you pay for hearing it. Grace looked at the scarf, then at him, and for the first time since the diner, she did not close the door. Grace did not invite Daniel in immediately. She stood in the doorway of her apartment with one hand resting on the frame, her face calm in a way that told him she had already cried enough where he could not see. The hallway light flickered above them, painting everything in tired yellow. Daniel held the folded scarf between his hands as if it were something fragile and undeserved. For the first time since she had known him, he did not look mysterious. He looked exposed. And that made Grace more careful, not less hurt. You have 10 minutes, she said. Daniel nodded. Thank you. She stepped aside, and he entered the small apartment quietly. He noticed everything because he had trained himself to notice rooms, the cracked window sealed with tape, the uneven kitchen chair, the stack of bills held beneath a chipped mug, the notebook on the table. But this time, he did not let his mind calculate solutions. He did not price the repairs. He did not imagine a better apartment. He forced himself to see her life without trying to purchase his way out of what he had done. Grace closed the door and remained standing. Daniel understood and did not sit. He placed the scarf gently on the table, not close enough to pressure her to take it, not far enough to pretend it did not matter. I lied to you, he said. Grace's eyes stayed on his face. Not only by omission, not only because I was afraid, I lied because I wanted control. I wanted to know who you were before I allowed you to know who I was. His voice tightened. And that was wrong. Grace did not soften. She did not reward the first honest sentence with forgiveness. Daniel was grateful for that, because some part of him knew he needed to speak without being rescued. I told myself I was protecting myself, he continued, from greed, from being used, from another person loving my name instead of me. He looked down briefly, then forced his eyes back to hers. But the truth is uglier than that. I was willing to test your character while hiding mine. The words entered the room slowly. Grace heard the difference between excuse and confession, and this at least was not an excuse. Still, truth arriving late did not erase what lateness had cost. You let me pity you, she said. Daniel flinched. Yes. You let me defend you? Yes. You let me speak to you about my mother, my dream, my fear of temporary people, while you knew you might sign away the street I loved. His face paled. Yes. Grace turned toward the window because looking at him made anger and tenderness fight too closely inside her chest. Outside, Brookhaven's evening lights trembled in the glass. I keep asking myself which part was real, she said. The man in the rain? The man at the diner? The man on the bridge? Or the man in the suit? Daniel took a breath. All of them were real. Grace looked back sharply. He lowered his voice. But I understand why that answer may not be enough. No, she said. It is not. He nodded, accepting the blow. The man in the rain was real in what he felt, but false in what he allowed you to believe. The man at the diner was real when he admired you, but false when he stayed silent. The man on the bridge was real when he wanted to tell you everything, but false when he chose fear instead. He swallowed hard. And the man in the suit is real too. He is the one responsible for all of them. Grace's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Do you know what hurt the most? Daniel waited. It was not that you had money. I know. No, I need you to hear me. He nodded once, silent. It hurt because I gave you kindness freely, and you turned it into evidence. I thought I was meeting a person. You were conducting an experiment. Her hand pressed against her chest, as if holding something in place. That makes love feel foolish. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. I know, he said again. But this time the words broke. And I hate that I did that to you. Grace watched him carefully. She had seen powerful people perform regret when consequences arrived. She had seen men apologize to restore comfort, not repair harm. But Daniel did not move toward her. He did not reach for her hand. He did not ask what he could do to make it better. For once he seemed to understand that her pain was not a problem placed in front of him to solve. I stopped the acquisition process, he said. Grace's face changed immediately, and Daniel lifted a hand before she could answer. I am not telling you that to buy forgiveness. You do not owe me gratitude. You do not owe me a conversation. You do not owe me anything because I finally stopped doing harm. The words mattered, but Grace did not trust them yet. What does stopped mean? It means no forced purchase, no pressure through debt, no silent takeover of Maple Street. I am restructuring the deal into a preservation fund with local ownership protected. She stared at him, trying to hear both the businessman and the man. And Maggie's? She asked. The diner will not be taken. That is not an answer. Daniel nodded slowly. No, it is not. Maggie's debts are being handled through a private community relief account that cannot be tied publicly to me. Grace's expression hardened. So you are still secretly moving money? Yes, he said, because the damage was already moving secretly too. But I will not attach my name to it, and I will not attach your name to it. Maggie will decide what happens to her diner, not me. The room grew very quiet. Grace wanted to reject all of it because accepting any good from him felt dangerous. But she also thought of Maggie in a hospital bed, worried about bills she had hidden from everyone. She thought of the diner, the regulars, the old booths, the coffee that tasted like home even when life did not. You should have done the right thing before I got hurt, she said. Daniel's shoulders fell. Yes. You should have told me before the suit. Yes. You should have trusted me with the truth if you wanted my trust. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. For the first time, Grace sat down at the kitchen table. Daniel remained standing until she glanced toward the other chair. Only then did he sit, carefully, as if still aware he had not earned comfort in her home. The scarf lay between them like a blue line drawn through the story of who they had been. Why me? Grace asked. Daniel frowned faintly. What do you mean? Why did I matter enough to delay everything, but not enough to deserve honesty? That question hurt him more than any accusation. Daniel looked at the table, at the scarf, then back at her. Because you became the first person in years whose opinion of me mattered more than their approval. Grace did not look away. And that scared you? It terrified me. Because I was poor? No. His answer came quickly, painfully. Because you were clear. Because I could not charm you with status you did not know I had. Because when you looked at me, I felt seen and judged by something money could not impress. He breathed in unsteadily. And because I knew that if you saw the truth too soon, I might lose the one person who liked me when she thought I had nothing. Grace absorbed the confession with a sadness that did not yet know where to go. That is the part you still do not understand, she said. I did not like you because I thought you had nothing. I liked you because I thought you were honest about having nothing. Daniel bowed his head. There was no defense against that. No explanation refined enough. Grace continued more softly. I have lived with very little, Daniel. I am not romantic about poverty. I know what bills do to a person. I was not attracted to your struggle. Her eyes shone. I was attracted to what I thought was your humility. The sentence struck him like a verdict. Humility. The one thing he had pretended to have and therefore proved he lacked. I want to become that, he said. Grace looked tired suddenly. Wanting is not becoming. No, Daniel said. It is not. For a moment, they sat with the painful honesty between them. Outside, a car passed slowly through the wet street. Inside, neither of them reached for the past because both understood it could not be picked up unchanged. Daniel stood when the 10 minutes had long since become 30. I will leave now, he said. Grace did not stop him. At the door, he turned back, his hand resting on the knob, but not opening it yet. I'm going to keep doing what I should have done from the beginning, he said. Not because I expect you to watch, not because I expect you to forgive me, but because you were right about me. His voice trembled. And I do not want your pain to be the only honest thing that came from knowing me. Grace remained at the table after he left, staring at the scarf he had not taken back. She could still feel anger, sharp and necessary. She could still feel love, too, wounded and unwanted, but alive enough to frighten her. That was the cruelest part of betrayal. It did not always kill love immediately. Sometimes it left love standing in the ruins, asking whether trust could ever be rebuilt without insulting the heart a second time. Grace reached for the scarf, held it once, then set it down again. And somewhere across town, Daniel Hart walked alone through Brookhaven, beginning the long work of becoming a man who would not need a disguise to be worthy of her respect. For the next 2 weeks, Daniel Hart did not enter Maggie's diner. He did not wait outside Grace's apartment. He did not send flowers, expensive gifts, handwritten apologies on thick cream paper, or any of the elegant gestures a man like him could arrange before breakfast. For the first time in his life, Daniel forced himself to do the harder thing. Nothing that would corner her, nothing that would impress her, nothing that would make forgiveness feel like a debt. He stayed close enough to repair what he had damaged in Brookhaven, but far enough not to turn Grace's healing into another project under his control. And that distance taught him more about love than any confession had. Grace heard things anyway. Brookhaven was too small for silence to last long. She heard that the pressure on Maggie's diner had suddenly stopped. She heard the bank manager had been seen leaving a meeting looking pale and apologetic. She heard that the Maple Street acquisition had been suspended, then restructured, then turned into something no one fully understood, except that local owners were no longer being pushed out. She heard Brian had been forced to sit through a legal review of workplace behavior and nearly choked on the words employee dignity. Each rumor carried Daniel's shadow, and each one made Grace both grateful and angry, because Daniel was doing good now. That mattered. But goodness after damage still had to pass through the wound damage made. Grace refused to let the town turn him into a hero too quickly. People loved redemption when they did not have to feel the betrayal first. They saw debts delayed and buildings protected, and they sighed with relief. Grace saw the man on the bridge, unable to answer a question that could have saved her heart. She saw the suit entering the diner. She heard again the name, Mr. Hart, landing in the room like the end of innocence. So she kept working, but not at Maggie's. At least, not at first. Maggie called from the hospital and told Grace that quitting dramatically was only allowed if one returned dramatically as well. Grace laughed for the first time in days, then cried because Maggie sounded weaker than she wanted to admit. By the end of the call, Grace agreed to help a few mornings a week until Maggie could decide what came next. But she made one thing clear. She would not return because Daniel had fixed anything. She would return because the diner had loved her before he ever entered it. When Grace walked back into Maggie's diner, the regulars tried not to stare and failed completely. Miss Ruth patted the booth beside her. Mr. Collins folded his newspaper with exaggerated seriousness, as if giving her privacy by making noise. Brian stood near the counter, looking smaller than usual. For once, he did not bark in order. He cleared his throat and said, "Grace, I owe you an apology." The room went so quiet that even the coffee machine seemed to pause. Grace looked at him, surprised by the stiffness in his shoulders. "I spoke to you badly," Brian said, "and to customers, and to Daniel when I thought he was—" He stopped, embarrassed by the sentence before finishing it. "When you thought he was poor?" Grace asked. Brian swallowed. "Yes." Grace held his gaze long enough for him to feel the full shape of it. Then she nodded once. "Do better when no one powerful is watching?" Brian's face reddened, but he did not argue. For Grace, that was enough for one morning. Later, while the diner emptied after breakfast, Claire entered alone. Grace recognized Daniel's assistant immediately. The navy dress, the careful posture, the eyes of a woman who had seen too much business to be fooled by pretty language. Grace stiffened, but Claire lifted both hands slightly. "I'm not here to speak for Daniel," she said. "Then why are you here?" Claire placed a folder on the counter but did not push it toward Grace. "To speak for myself, and to tell you what is happening with Maple Street, because you deserve facts without having to ask him for them." Grace considered refusing, but the town mattered more than her pride, and pride had already been confused with dignity too many times in her life. So she listened. Claire explained that Hartwell Development had withdrawn from direct acquisition of the district. A preservation trust was being created, with Maggie, 2 local business owners, the church treasurer, and an independent attorney on the board. Hartwell money would fund repairs, debt relief, and small business grants, but Hartwell would not own the properties it helped protect. Grace listened carefully, searching for the hidden hook. There had to be one. Men like Daniel did not build doors without keys. "What does Daniel get?" Grace asked. Claire's expression softened in a way Grace did not expect. Trouble with his board, a reputation for becoming sentimental, several angry investors, and maybe the first decent night's sleep he has had in years. Grace looked down at the folder. That sounds noble when you say it? It is not noble, Claire replied. It is overdue. The honesty made Grace look back at her. Claire continued, he knows that. I think that is why he has not come here. Grace touched the edge of the counter. He sent you instead. No, Claire said. I came because I watched him build a life where every mistake could be managed by money, and then I watched you become the first person who would not let him manage the damage. I thought you should know the difference between a performance and a change. And this is change? Claire hesitated. It is a beginning. Grace appreciated that she did not call it more. Beginnings were honest. Miracles, too, quickly named, often became manipulation. That evening, Grace went to the empty flower shop on Maple Street. The paper sign still read, "For lease," but the dust had been cleaned from the window and a new notice had been placed beside the door. Applications were open for a local small business grant through the Preservation Trust. Grace stood in front of the glass for a long time, reading the words again and again. Her dream was suddenly closer, not handed to her, not wrapped in Daniel's apology, closer. And somehow that made her knees weak. She went inside with the key the attorney had given her after a formal application meeting that felt almost too real to trust. The shop smelled of old wood, fresh paint, and possibility. Someone had repaired the leak near the back wall. Someone had replaced the cracked front light. Someone had done just enough to make the place safe without erasing its history. Grace stood in the middle of the empty room and imagined buckets of roses near the window, wildflowers in the corner, white lilies for funerals, sunflowers for apologies that arrived late but sincerely. Then she imagined Daniel standing there, and the ache returned. 3 days later, she saw him at the town meeting, not in a suit worth more than her rent, though she knew now that he owned many. He wore a simple dark coat, not the old costume, not the billionaire armor, but something ordinary enough not to announce a role. He stood near the back of the community hall while the attorney explained the Preservation Trust. He did not speak unless asked. He did not take credit. He did not look for applause. But when Grace entered, his eyes found her the way they always had. This time, he looked away first. That small act affected her more than she wanted to admit. Not because it was romantic, because it was respectful. Daniel had seen her, and for once he had not tried to pull her gaze toward him. He let her choose whether to acknowledge him. Grace sat beside Miss Ruth, hands folded tightly in her lap, and listened as townspeople asked questions about repairs, rent protections, and business ownership. Daniel answered only when the attorney directed a specific question to him. Each answer was clear, practical, and stripped of charm. No grand speech, no emotional display, no attempt to turn accountability into theater. At the end of the meeting, Grace stepped outside into the cold night before most people left. She needed air. The stars were faint above Brookhaven, hidden behind thin clouds, and the streetlights hummed softly over the parking lot. She heard the door open behind her, then close. Daniel's footsteps stopped several feet away. He did not come closer. "Grace," he said. Her name was quiet in the dark. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself, then turned. "Daniel." For a moment neither spoke. The space between them carried everything: rain, coffee, pie, the bridge, the suit, the scarf, the apartment, the apology, the weeks of silence. Daniel kept his hands visible at his sides, as if even his posture needed to prove it would not take what was not offered. "You look tired," Grace said before she could stop herself. A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. "I probably earned that." She almost smiled too, and the almost was dangerous, so she looked away. "I saw the flower shop notice," she said. Daniel nodded. "It is open to anyone who applies." "I did apply." "I know." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Daniel, I know because the attorney informed the trust that applications came in. I did not read yours. I did not ask to." Grace studied him, looking for the old control, the hidden hand, the elegant manipulation. She found fear instead, not fear of losing power. Fear of failing the truth now that he had finally begun to tell it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. Daniel absorbed the words without flinching away. "I know. I don't know if I can trust what I feel. I know, and I don't want to be loved as someone's lesson." His eyes filled then, but he didn't step toward her. "You are not my lesson, Grace. You are the person I hurt while learning one I should have learned long before you." The wind moved between them, cold and clean. Grace looked at him for a long time. Then she said the only truth she could offer without betraying herself. "I'm not closing the door, but I'm not opening it quickly either." Spring arrived in Brookhaven slowly, as if the town itself needed time to trust warmth again. Snow disappeared from the edges of the sidewalks. Rain washed the old dust from Maple Street, and the first pale buds appeared on the trees outside Maggie's diner. Grace noticed every sign of change because she was changing too, though not in the dramatic way people like to imagine. Healing did not arrive like a sunrise all at once. It came in small decisions: getting out of bed, returning to work, filling out the flower shop application, choosing not to hate Daniel even on days when forgiveness still felt too far away. The Preservation Trust approved her application on a Thursday afternoon. Grace read the letter 3 times before she understood it was real. She had not been gifted the shop. She had earned the chance to lease it fairly, with a grant for repairs and a repayment plan gentle enough for a dream to breathe. Maggie cried when Grace told her. Miss Ruth insisted that the grand opening needed lemon cake. Brian, still awkward but trying, offered to help move boxes, and Daniel sent nothing: no flowers, no note, no congratulations wrapped in elegance. For once he let the moment belong entirely to her. That silence touched Grace more deeply than a gift would have, not because she wanted distance forever, but because Daniel had finally understood that love was not proven by entering every room loudly. Sometimes love waited outside. Sometimes it gave space. Sometimes it chose not to turn someone else's victory into a stage for apology. For 3 weeks, Grace worked inside the flower shop from sunrise until her hands smelled of paint, soil, and hope. She sanded shelves, cleaned glass, wrote supplier lists, and painted the front door a soft green her mother would have loved. Every small task felt like reclaiming something Daniel's lie had almost taken from her. The shop opened on a clear Saturday morning under the name Grace and Rose Flowers. Grace had chosen Rose for her mother, and when the new sign went up, she stood on the sidewalk with one hand pressed over her heart. People came all day. Maggie arrived in a wheelchair, stubbornly wearing lipstick and declaring the place too pretty for anyone to leave without buying something. Miss Ruth bought daisies for herself because, as she said, women should not wait for funerals or apologies to receive flowers. Even Brian came in, nervous and red-faced, and purchased a small bouquet for Maggie. Brookhaven, for one day, felt like a town stitched back together. Daniel came near closing time. Grace saw him through the window before the bell above the door rang. He stood outside for a moment, looking at the sign, the flowers, the warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. He wore no disguise now, not poverty, not wealth, just a dark coat, an open face, and the quiet hesitation of a man who knew the door he approached had once been closed for a reason. When he entered, the shop filled with the cool scent of evening and something unspoken. Grace looked up from tying ribbon around a bouquet of white tulips. "Hi," he said. It was such a simple word after everything that had passed between them. Grace felt her heart answer before her voice did. "Hi." And Daniel looked around the shop slowly, taking in the shelves, the buckets of roses, the handwritten cards, the old counter she had restored instead of replacing. "It's beautiful," he said. Grace tied the ribbon into a careful knot. "It's honest." His eyes returned to hers, and the sadness in them softened into something like gratitude. "The best kind," he said. For a moment, the memory of the diner moved between them. Coffee, pie, rain, scarf, betrayal, apology. But it no longer stood like a wall. It stood like a scar, still there, still part of the story, but no longer bleeding. Daniel stepped closer, then stopped at the distance he had learned to respect. "I wanted to come earlier," he said. "I know. I didn't because it was mine," Grace finished. He nodded. "Yes." Grace set the tulips aside and came around the counter. There had been a time when standing this close to him would have made the wound roar. Now it ached, but it also remembered. It remembered the man in the rain and the man who lied. It remembered the man who hurt her and the man who chose to stop hiding. Love had not erased the truth, but truth, slowly and painfully, had made love possible again. She looked at him and saw not a perfect man. She saw a changed one, and maybe that was the only kind of man forgiveness could meet. "I need to tell you something," Grace said. Daniel's expression became still, attentive. She almost smiled at how carefully he listened now, as if every word from her deserved a place to land. "I forgave you before I was ready to love you again." His breath caught. "I thought forgiveness would feel like opening the door completely, but it didn't. It felt like unlocking it, then standing there for a long time, deciding whether the person outside had learned how to enter gently." Daniel's eyes shone. "And did he?" Grace looked down, then back up. "He's learning." Daniel swallowed hard, and for a moment the powerful man the world knew disappeared completely. "I love you," he said. No performance, no velvet speech, no promise decorated with money, just the truth, bare and trembling. "I loved you badly at first, because fear was louder than honesty. But I love you differently now. Not because you saved me, not because you proved something, because when I look at you, I want to be a man who can stand in the light without asking you to carry my shadows." Grace closed her eyes briefly as the words moved through her. When she opened them, tears had gathered, but they were not the same tears she had cried on her apartment floor. These did not humiliate her. They released something. "I love you too," she whispered. Daniel's face changed as if the sentence had reached a place in him no victory had ever touched. "But I need you to understand," she continued, stepping closer. "I'm not loving the man in the rain. I'm not loving the money. I am not loving the apology." She placed one hand gently against his chest. "I am loving the man who finally stopped pretending." Daniel covered her hand with his slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Outside, the last light of evening stretched across Maple Street, touching the diner windows, the grocery store awning, the old bridge in the distance. Brookhaven glowed with the quiet beauty of ordinary places that had almost been lost and were now being loved more carefully. Inside the flower shop, surrounded by roses, tulips, lilies, and the scent of new beginnings, Daniel leaned closer. He paused just before reaching her, asking without words. Grace answered by rising on her toes. Their kiss was soft at first, almost reverent, as if both understood that love returned after broken trust must be held with gentler hands. Then Daniel's arms came around her, careful but sure, and Grace let herself lean into him without feeling smaller. The kiss carried rain, an honest pie, anger and apology, silence and waiting, the ache of what had been broken, and the wonder of what had been rebuilt. It was not the kiss of two people pretending nothing had happened. It was the kiss of two people who knew exactly what had happened and chose, with open eyes, to begin again. When they parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "I'll spend my life proving you were safe to trust me again," he whispered. Grace smiled through her tears. "Do not spend your life proving," she said. "Spend it being honest." A quiet laugh broke from him, tender and relieved. "I can do that." "You'll have to," she said, touching the blue scarf now folded on a shelf behind the counter. "I kept evidence." Daniel looked at the scarf and smiled, but the emotion in his eyes made the moment sacred. That evening, after the shop closed, Grace turned the sign on the door from open to closed, but she did not lock it right away. Daniel stood beside her, not leading, not taking over, simply there. Together they looked out at Maple Street, where the diner lights were still on, and people moved through the town with the fragile hope of those who had survived a hard season. Grace slipped her hand into his. This time, there was no test, no disguise, no hidden name, only two people standing in the doorway of a future neither could buy, control, or guarantee. And when Grace finally turned the key, she knew the door that mattered most had not closed. It had opened, slowly, honestly, and just enough for love to enter.